Our beliefs are some of the most core elements of who we are and determine how it is that we will think, feel, and behave. These are developed over time and through the experiences of our exposure to the environment around us. These beliefs, however, are not definitive of who we are, nor limit the ability and the extent to which we can become. Many of us become what we experience, others in spite of this. This would never be evidenced more by the difference in environment and personality displayed by the grieving children in this case, as opposed to the beliefs of their father. There is an old adage that states, if there is no mud, there is no lotus, and at times, this is true in some of the cruelest of circumstances in the cases we cover. In this instance, the concept of the lotus is the perfect analogy to demonstrate how out of this tragically dark and troublesome case could shine such bright light. Indeed, it is fair to say that some of the brightest lights possible would ultimately shine as we conclude the murder of Zahra Abrahimzadeh on this, the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome again to Just Lawful, where things indeed do go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and I am again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
Thanks, Daniel, and welcome back, everybody, to our continuing coverage of this case.
Absolutely. Look, before we begin, a huge thank you to everyone listening. If you haven't heard our previous episodes, we'd strongly recommend and greatly appreciate you going over to iTunes and Spotify, subscribing, leaving a 5-star rating, reviewing us, all of that. That's how you get our message and help us to get our message out to the masses, as we say. If you haven't heard the previous episodes of this, we strongly recommend going back and listening, particularly to this case, to understand where we're up to. And I just understand the nature of this and the triggering and sensitive nature of what we're talking about. And to that point, if you do find anything we've discussed on any of those episodes or this coming episode, please make use of the following support resources. The Domestic Violence Crisis Service on 1300 782 200. The Domestic Violence Gateway Service on 1-800 800 098, the National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service on 1-800 RESPECT. For those who are interstate and international, obviously, whichever agencies are the same in your area. Also, please take some time to check out the Zahra Foundation website, zahrafoundation.org.au, as well as DV SafePhone at dvsafephone.org. Wonderful organisations who assist those who are affected by family and domestic violence. As usual, Sean, at the end of our last episode, you left us on a cliffhanger. You said that after this case was adjourned until an afternoon, something would happen which you had never encountered before.
And I also told you that of all the cases that I'd covered to this point in my career, this was the one that most felt like television in terms of that cut and thrust legal drama that you see on those shows.
Indeed you did.
So we'd been adjourned a couple of times in a row. The cross-examination of Zahra Abrahimzadeh, accused of killing his wife, murdering her in front of 300 people, postponed again and again. He'd already been on the stand being cross-examined for 3 days.
Yeah.
And if you remember, it was not going well for him. He'd made all sorts of ludicrous, outlandish defences of his behaviour. He was clashing repeatedly with the prosecutor, Sandy McDonald, clearly didn't like being questioned by a woman. Ms. McDonald had used that to her advantage and had broken him down to the point where he was prepared to admit that the woman his children said he was having an affair with was some kind of second temporary wife.
As you stated, the story was falling apart. She was picking away at the threads and pulling those threads and unpicking that story apart.
Absolutely. I think I called her a pit bull in a very respectful sense in our most recent episode.
You did.
Look, this was the pit bull tearing chunks out of this argument, bite by bite by bite, breaking him down. When we finally came back to court, Heather Stokes, Zahra's defense counsel, said, "My client would like to change his plea."
Okay.
Now, this is a jury trial, don't forget.
Mm.
You can't change your plea in a jury trial without the jury being present.
Okay. So at this stage, they're not present.
They're not present.
Okay.
Just in front of the judge. Your Honour, we've had this brought back on. My client wishes to change his plea. My ears prick up. I'm the only journalist present.
Okay.
Nobody else had come back after lunch. But I just had a weird suspicion, so I'd stuck around. Sure enough, the jury comes back in, and the charge of murder is read to Zahra Abrahimzadeh again. Zahra Abrahimzadeh, it is alleged that on March 21st, 2010, at Adelaide, you murdered Zahra Abrahimzadeh. How do you plead?
Mm.
Ziola, who'd been giving all of his evidence to this point through an interpreter, turns to his interpreter and says something. The interpreter responds, "Even though it was not my intention to do what I did, for what happened, I will plead guilty."
Mm.
There's that arrogance coming out again.
I didn't think that you were able to add
Commentary?
commentary, verbiage, opinion around it. I thought it was guilty or not guilty.
Well, Your Honour, allow me to pontificate for a moment about the morality of my situation. No, you say guilty or not guilty.
Sure.
So, Justice John Sulin looked at Sandy McDonald, the prosecutor, and Ms. McDonald said, "We don't accept that plea in satisfaction of the information, Your Honour." Justice Sulin said to Miss Stokes, "Sorry, Miss Stokes, the trial's going to go on." "Hold on a minute," says Heather Stokes. Has a conversation with her client. "Could we have the charge read again?"
Okay.
Round 2. Round 3 total, because of course he pleaded not guilty at the start of the trial.
Correct.
Zahra Abrahimzadeh, March 21st, 2010, in Adelaide, murdered your wife, Zahra Abrahimzadeh. How do you plead? "For what happened, I felt sorry, and I plead guilty." Ms. McDonald didn't even wait for the judge at that point. She stood up and said, "Justice Sulin, we do not accept that. That is completely unacceptable." Justice Sulin said, "I agree. We're going to have to continue this trial." "Hold on a minute," says Heather Stokes. "Can I have one more adjournment, please, Your Honour?" We're getting toward 5 p.m.
Yeah. So how long is this taking?
This is chewing up most of the last couple of hours of court.
Sure.
Because it's blood from a stone.
Absolutely.
You can tell what's going on here. He's realised, Ziola has realised, he's done. Everything Sandy has done to pull him apart, Ms. McDonald, has done to pull him apart, has worked. His argument has failed. The best thing he can do right now is cop a guilty plea and hope, just hope, that Justice Sulin will show him some kind of mercy in sentencing. But he can't get the words out.
Yeah.
He can't admit what he's done.
It's still that obnoxious pride and arrogance just will not allow him to let go, yeah?
As a man, I cannot possibly lower myself to admit that I have done something to a woman and that is wrong for me to have done that. After 13 years in this country abusing Zahra, after decades of abusing Zahra in Iran, he just can't admit that what he did was wrong. So after that final 20-minute adjournment, we come back again. Zahra Abrahimzadeh, on March 21st, 2010, in Adelaide, you murdered your wife. How do you plead? This time, instead of turning to the interpreter, Zahra Abrahimzadeh looks directly forward, shakes his head and says in English, "Guilty."
So can I just pick up on that point there? So you said just then that throughout the entire trial up to this point, he'd been communicating via an interpreter.
That's right.
At this point, he stops, looks, and himself in English says, "Guilty." So could Ziola speak English?
Absolutely.
So this entire time that he's been using an interpreter, what is that about?
There's a belief that if you have English as a second language in court, perhaps there might be some legal terms, some terminology, some bits and pieces that might come out of left field and be beyond your scope.
Sure, okay, being the second language. Okay,
so you have an interpreter with you there the whole time. Most people who do that tend to use the interpreter as literally a resource. Turn around, wait a minute, what does that mean?
What does that point mean? What is this?
A translator, like you see on television.
Yeah.
Ziola had chosen to speak in his native language the entire time. And again, to me, that was a power move.
Indeed.
An absolute move of arrogance. I will not lower myself to speak your language while you're accusing me of doing things.
Well, certainly, as you said, at this point, when you get to a situation that you can now clearly speak that when you want to, Absolutely.
Well, when you're forced to. I don't think
Sure.
want to came
No.
into this with him.
When you are determined you need to. However, he still could have given that through the interpreter.
Absolutely.
It is that arrogance and that power domination type.
To Miss MacDonald, I think it was a sign of final capitulation, though.
Okay,
This was, I certainly took it that way.
sure.
The arrogance had finally been drained out of him. He was not going anywhere.
Okay,
So as a result, again, we've got a jury here. A jury is supposed to come back with a verdict independent of what goes on. You know, they're supposed to assess
Okay.
the evidence. So Justice Sulin turns to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury and says, I direct you to find the defendant guilty because he's confessed in front of you.
so yeah, at that point, that's where, because it's the case, the judge says, well, there's no other verdict here. You need to come back. But the jury still needs to make that determination, and they still need to come back with that decision.
That's right. So even though he pleaded guilty, the record shows forever that a jury of the Supreme Court found him guilty of murder.
Right, okay.
So he doesn't even get the satisfaction of writing the ending to that part of the story. The
Wow.
jury still found him guilty because his guilty plea technically turns into a piece of evidence.
Absolutely, and that's an interesting point you make. For a man who has tried to dictate this whole scenario and exercise his power throughout this entire situation, even though he has determined, I will take control of this and say I am guilty, he still doesn't get that. I don't know if there's satisfaction. That I would imagine in his mind there is some area of, I still control this. That still will never actually show that, because even though he has done that, as you said, it's now tendered as evidence. So even that one little piece that he may be clinging to has been removed from him, and that is, a jury of his peers, and I state that deliberately, his peers, i.e. not above nor below, peers have determined that yes, you are found guilty of this charge.
All of his power, all of his pride, all of his position has been stripped from him by his children, by the police, by the evidence, by the jury, by the judges, and by a female prosecutor. It's his ultimate nightmare.
Zahra Abrahimzadeh was found guilty by the jury after finally 4 rounds in, having those charges read to him, and eventually he admitted the guilt of killing Zahra. After that, what happens from a court process and all that? What happens here, Sean?
Well, let me just say, I was caught completely off guard by this. I'd never seen anything like this.
Right, okay.
Again, to go to that movie, television show
Sure.
place for a minute, to divorce the seriousness of this crime
Okay.
from everything else. Somebody confessing in the middle of cross-examination, that's like the big sting moment in a movie or something like that. You know, the you can't handle the truth kind of moment from A
Okay.
Few Good Men. To see that actually play out in front of me was staggering.
Right.
Absolutely staggering. Full props to Prosecutor Sandy MacDonald to get a confession on the stand. Just amazing work. I've not seen it since.
Well, that was going to be my question. You said you'd not seen that. So, the cut and thrust and parry you mentioned of that sort of, that courtroom sort of Hollywood drama style thing. So you hadn't seen it before, and as you said, you'd not. So this hasn't happened again.
Not in my time in courts, no.
Amazing.
So there was a fair level of, let's call it, lawful satisfaction
Sure.
with that happening.
Yeah.
As a moment in law,
Okay.
that was aces. In terms of justice, though, there was no satisfaction in it whatsoever.
Okay.
And as usual, Arman Abrahimzadeh summed it up best.
Okay. Sure.
He said to me, "My father is a stubborn man who will stick to his pleas and his ways. So we didn't see this coming. But he did not really take responsibility. The way he worded his plea, he was saying he was sorry for what happened, but he was not sorry for his actions. Those are two different statements, and it's about time he took responsibility for his actions."
It's a really good point, isn't it? He's absolutely still not, even at that point, taking any responsibility for his actions.
It's just versus lawful.
Yeah.
Lawfully, he's confessed. Justice-wise, not in the slightest.
Yeah, I mean, even by the initial attempts at his admission of guilt, he did everything he could to remove himself from being guilty. It was almost, he was doing it out of almost spite that he had to actually admit this.
I'm guilty by your laws. I'm guilty by your impression of the situation. But, my purity remains untouched. That's what those first couple of guilty plea attempts, if you can call them that, were. So I got mad.
Okay.
The more Arman spoke to me about it,
Yeah.
and the more I thought about it, the madder I got.
Sure.
Because he meaning Ziola, didn't deserve what a guilty plea means. You know,
Sure.
it's supposed to be a sign of contrition
Yeah.
and remorse, and he doesn't deserve that, especially when he's calling character witnesses then at the sentencing submissions who are talking about what a kind and gentle man he is and how he wouldn't hurt a fly, wouldn't hurt an ant, and one young man around Armin's age who wanted to claim that Ziola was like a father figure to him. It was disgusting.
Yeah,
It was
right.
absolutely disgusting, and I thought, well, what can I do here as a journalist to do something to bleed off my anger and help the community understand, don't be swayed by
Okay.
this guy is still a creep. I thought back to that very first piece of evidence that Miss MacDonald led,
Sure.
the letter. In his own words, what sort of human being Ziola was.
Yeah.
So I used the form that you used to apply for it from the court,
Mhm.
and I didn't think I was going to get it. Justice John Sulan and I had heat, let's put it that way. We had
Okay.
some fractious history between us, and I'm sure we'll get to that one day down the track, but I didn't expect him to give over that document because, as we learned during the Hillier case, documents are only provided when and if the judge chooses to provide them.
Sure.
To my surprise, Justice Sulan gave me the entirety of Ziola's letter.
Okay. So this is just to recap, this is the letter that he sent to Arman when he was in custody.
That's right, the one that was all about, you know, when you seek out to be destroyed by somebody, sometimes they are destroyed in the process, that sort of stuff. What we'd heard in court was but the very tip of this nonsense,
Yeah, right.
the upper layer of this garbage heap of humanity. Have a listen to this. This is how I wrote it up at the time, and we're talking here 20th of April 2012. It's when I wrote this article. In the letter, Abrahimzadeh tells Arman he deplores enemies who laid the foundation for the murder. I condemn those who put wealth and materialism ahead of integrity, principles, and dignity, he says. You may remember he was upset about the $400,000 house in Iran.
That is exactly what I was thinking, but please continue, yeah.
He blames Zahra and her family for driving him towards insanity by denying him 3/4 of the equity in their former Iranian home.
Which just further is so hypocritical in regard to putting wealth in front of... Okay, please continue, yep.
He asks Arman, how much do you think the body and mind of a human being can tolerate? How long can a human being live with fear and anxiety with no security? I don't know, Ziola. Why don't we ask Zahra how long she lived in anxiety and fear with no security? I'd say the entirety of your marriage. Wait, we can't ask her anymore because you're a murderer.
Mm-hmm.
He then filled the next 1.5 pages of this letter with details of all of the family's possessions, including televisions, jewels, and gold. A laundry list of everything he felt was owed to him.
Again, putting wealth... Okay, yep. Okay.
And he says to Arman in this letter, I will not allow anybody to take what is rightfully ours. When someone is trying to destroy you in any possible way, you would defend yourself, and sometimes this defense results in the destruction of the opposing party. And the closing paragraph of this letter was those prophetic words we heard at the start of the trial. You're an Eastern man. I ask you to judge me in a fair and masculine manner. In any case, I am really sorry about what happened, but there's one line that wasn't read out at trial. The final line of the letter. I think I am also a victim of what happened.
Okay. As I can anecdotally hear the blood pressure of many of our listeners boiling right now, and probably the sheer frustration and adamant, borderline sort of hatred of this gentleman, I've got to ask you, sitting in court through this entire trial, listening to this, seeing him in action, hearing how he tried to dictate and demand and be in charge, and just some of the phrasing you've just used as you spoke about that, I want to ask you, what did you think of this man, or how did this feel? How did you react to this?
Utter contempt.
Okay.
An absolutely contemptible, disgraceful excuse for a human being. There are exactly 3 things Ziola Abrahimzadeh did right, and that was allow Arman, Atena, and Anita to exist in this world. Nothing else.
Yeah, right.
He is a complete waste. This tiny little man who has insecurities up the wazoo and chooses to take them out on each and every person around them. He twists his marriage, he twists his paternal relationships, he twists his religion, his faith, the culture of his people, everything to fit this shrewish little worldview that means that he is always the righteous person, always the one in control, always the one to be listened to, while running around with another woman on the side.
Yeah, right.
And it's all projection. You know, that's the thing. Like, the whole thing about I condemn those who put wealth and materialism ahead of integrity, principles, and dignity, that's what he did his entire life.
Absolutely.
It's textbook projection. What he hated about himself, what he knew was wrong about himself, what he knew was disgusting about himself, he took and he painted everybody he met with.
Yeah, right.
His own self-loathing spread far and wide.
Yeah, right. It's fair to say you had a very dim view of this person as a human being.
Wow, I didn't know you had a gift for understatement like that, Daniel. And I wasn't the only one.
Sure.
Because when sentencing rolled around, Justice John Sulan and I, well, this might have been the first time that we'd agreed on anything.
Okay.
Great quote from Justice Sulan in sentencing. The letter demonstrates how you are completely self-absorbed and fail to have any regret for the misery you have caused to your family. Might well be why his Honour decided to release the letter to me. He wanted that context out there in the community.
Quite possibly, yeah.
He said, your excuses about the dark, ugly men attacking Anita was fanciful. I am satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that your act was premeditated and deliberate. You were motivated by the fact you had lost control of your family and in particular your wife. You took action because she continued to disobey your demands that she not proceed with the divorce. I accept you were distressed by the family situation. That may go towards explaining your conduct, but it can never excuse it. He sentenced Ziola to a life sentence with a 26-year non-parole period, saying it would have been 27 years had he not made that 11th hour guilty plea.
Oh, look, the only thing I'll say to that is I'm glad that the only concession he got was 1 year of a non-parole period, which is negligible, to be fair.
And let's be honest, you have to show actual genuine remorse and personal development before you can get parole, and I don't think he's capable of it.
Hence the reason I class that as negligible, because I don't think he's going to be capable of that either, and therefore I don't think it matters if it's 26 years, 27 years, 127 years. His demeanour and his output throughout this entire situation and the way he lived his life, etc., I don't consider that to be any way going to change in any short time.
Yeah, he is not going anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, it's a life sentence. We know that. Murder, we've talked about that before. That is just the standard. If it's murder and you are found guilty of murder, it's a standard life sentence with then a non-parole period put on it.
Which must be in excess of 20 years.
Correct. Was there anyone at this point that was upset, disputing that, debating that, the sentence itself?
Not at all. In fact, Ziola never filed an appeal.
Okay.
That was the end of him. He faded off into the distance.
Sure.
And Arman, as a result, got to have the final word. He said, "The agonizing and searing pain that this coward has caused us is one that will last a lifetime. The malicious nature and character of the criminal is one thing, but the actual fact is that this murder could have been prevented. We saw this murder coming, and it could have been stopped by the authorities. Today is just another day where the system failed to protect a brave woman, a caring friend, a loving mother. Regardless of the sentence, nothing will ever bring my mother back, nor will it give us any formal closure on this horrific chapter of our lives."
Arman is an incredibly well-spoken young man and is very articulate in the way that he puts his ideas, his thoughts, his emotions into what he said. He made some incredibly insightful points there, which is where we're going to head next, because we've gone through this. We know the horror that has been caused here. We've gone through a trial process. We understand what the outcome of this is, a life sentence. As Arman said, though, there is some systematic failures here which could have prevented this from occurring in the first place. And it's fair to say this story is far from finished.
As you say, Daniel, the story was far from finished, but there would be another delay first.
Okay.
Between the sentencing of Zahra Abrahimzadeh and the beginning of State Coroner Mark John's coronial inquest into the circumstances that preceded the death of Zahra Abrahimzadeh.
So we should say there, so we get to the point of the sentence happened. there's a situation where we need to investigate. So at some point, some department, someone has said there actually needs to be an investigation into what happened here.
Well, think about everything that we covered in our first episode of this series. Everything to do with the way the police and various organisations did and did not handle Ziola when he was vanished, missing around the place.
Yeah.
All of that leads to what's called a reportable death.
Right.
So in the same way that we know the coroner was involved in investigating the Hillier triple murder once it was done, now something needed to be done to investigate why there were systemic failures leading up to Zahra's death, and how can those systemic failures be prevented in the future. So it took 18 months to gather all of that evidence together, and then it was put before the coroner. He started hearing his inquest on September 30, 2013, and he came back with his findings in July of 2014.
Yeah, right.
Now, I said to you earlier that Ziola's guilty plea was unprecedented.
Yeah.
Here's our sequel in terms of things Sean had not seen before and has not seen again.
Okay.
Mr. Johns, the state coroner, came back with a 73-page report that I referred to in all of my coverage at the time as savage.
Wow.
Because it is one of the most savage pieces of legal documentation I have ever heard. Let me read you what I wrote. It ranks among the most damning indictments in recent legal history, and with good reason. Few documents depict widespread institutional incompetence, individual apathy, and an appalling lack of judgment better than the coronial findings into the death of Zahra Abrahimzadeh. Coroner Mark Johns' findings were scathing of SA Police for 13 months of failures and half-hearted investigations into Ziola's treatment of his wife. Mr. Johns' findings are no less than a scathing assessment of an organisation, SA Police, comprising people sworn to protect us, and a chilling indicator that in some cases, that vow is but a hollow promise.
You started off by stating that you class this as savage. That is some pretty scathing response or reporting, if you like, of the circumstances. So we know we've got a coronial inquest. We are looking into this. These are some of the things. So what was sort of the machinations or how was this taken or what was the, I guess, the impact of this?
So think back to all of those police officers that we highlighted in the first episode of this series who were involved with trying to find Ziola but chose to wash their car instead, who said that, you know, it would have been great to arrest him if they'd had the opportunity, but the opportunity never arose. The woman in the 000 Centre that was convinced that flagging was something we don't do. Each and every one of those people was called to give evidence at the inquest.
Okay.
Mr. Johns listened to what they had to say, and then in his findings, he gave his opinion of their performance. And he was not holding back. He said the power to arrest and charge is the most powerful influence that police can bring to bear against a person such as Ziola. If that power is not exercised expeditiously or worse, not exercised at all, the domestic violence offender will think he has gotten away with it. He said that error was compounded by dismissive attitudes. He said that the police's approach was fruitless and wrong-headed. Wrong-headed.
Okay, interesting.
He talked about the 000 operator. She became so inexplicably fixated on the word flagged that she missed the point of the call. Here's a quote. I find it utterly bizarre that any reasonable person could have interpreted the call as a piece of police jargon. Her remarkable obtuseness is so concerning that the situation should never be allowed to repeat itself.
Remarkably obtuseness.
Remarkable obtuseness.
Wow.
Here's a nice little summary of the whole thing. Police were slack, wrong-headed, disappointing, desultory, fruitless, half-hearted, and appalling.
Wow, that's very strong.
Well, hold on, because here's his ultimate conclusion. South Australia Police's slogan is keeping SA safe. That's a very good summary of its most important function. At every level, it was a hollow promise in the case of Zahra Abrahimzadeh.
Yeah, right.
That is beyond damning. Damning is not a big enough word for that.
Sure.
He has just said that police have failed from beginning to end to take action that conceivably could have prevented a murder. Now, He can't go completely out and say, this murder could have been prevented. And you and I have argued about this off air.
Yes, we have.
I'm of the belief that this murder could have been prevented, and we should be able to say that. You take a slightly different view to that based on what Mr. Johns has said.
I do, only because there is very good reason to believe, had these actions been taken, as we've stated, yep, there was definite systematic failures. It certainly would have minimised the probability of that. I totally get that. And it's just me, because I'm always objectively looking at the other angle in this, and not that I'm looking to be obtuse for the sake of it, nor do I want to dispel anything.
Or be remarkably obtuse.
Well, or that either. I've been classed as less than remarkable many times, Sean. In this case, though, I absolutely agree. We would have certainly minimised the opportunity and probability. I understand where we can't take that step to go, absolutely, had this happened, that murder would not have occurred. Maybe not there, not then, not in that manner. I don't know that whatever that would have been, how that would have worked out, would have necessarily stopped this. So I understand why we say very likely would not. We've certainly had our discussion off air about that.
Well, what happened in the public arena was Mr. Johns made 10 recommendations.
Sure.
Here's a list of things to do to make sure this never happens again. Don't wash the car when you're supposed to be looking for somebody, things like that.
Now, to be fair, those recommendations are just that, recommendations. There's nothing put in place to enforce that they need to happen.
That's right.
They definitely will. As you've also stated, though, it's very unlikely that they won't be taken on because, let's face it, in circumstances like this, you should probably be paying attention and doing something about that.
Well, here's where, for a change, I get to deliver you some good news.
Okay, sure.
The South Australian government, then a Labor government, accepted all recommendations without blinking.
Okay.
The Premier at the time said, domestic violence is fundamentally an issue of violence against women by men. It's disgraceful that more than 10,000 domestic violence incidents are reported each year, called for a change in community attitudes to match the changes that were going to be made within the system.
Yeah.
But here's the biggest part of the whole thing. Deputy Police Commissioner Grant Stevens, now as we record this, is the Police Commissioner, this time second in charge, publicly and privately apologised to Anita, Atena and Arman.
Right.
He said, police failed the Abrahimzadeh family on multiple occasions, and for this we are truly sorry. I have never hidden the fact that I think our service was appalling. We did not do a good enough job. We are extremely disappointed with the service we provided. Look, all praise to Grant Stevens for that.
Yes.
How often do you hear a public servant throw their hands up and say, we were wrong and we apologise unreservedly?
No, I was going to make that point. So I completely agree with you. For him to stand there, own that, and publicly come back and say, yes, we didn't do well enough, we were wrong, and it was appalling. The fact that he used the terminology appalling himself is in and of itself not just rare, it's really commendable that although through all of that situation that wasn't great and wasn't handled well, and there was so much that should have been done differently and recommendations put in place, he stood there and said, we didn't do that.
And throughout that entire situation, Arman and his sisters never blamed individual officers, never singled out individuals for criticism.
Yeah.
They wanted systemic change.
Sure.
And that apology that Grant Stevens gave them was accepted without reservation.
Well, that was going to be my question, because throughout this process of 2 years or so on from the sentencing to the coronial inquest findings coming out, and then them actually coming out and hearing that, what were sort of Arman, Atena and Anita's sort of throughout this process and at this point, how were they feeling? How was this taken by them?
They were thrilled to have the apology. They were saddened to see the extent of the systemic failure.
Of course.
And they were heartened by the idea that change was coming. You've got to remember, they were raised by a woman who believed in hope.
Yes.
Everything Zahra did was driven by that concept of hope. And here, after all those years of horror and suffering, they'd been given hope back. Hope that things were going to be better for the next family that found themselves in the same situation.
Yeah. Look, there's one other point I want to quickly raise here, and that is the fact that you made the statement, that, and I'm really glad you used the terminology, systematic failure. And they wanted to see change in the system, not necessarily assigning blame to individuals. And I think it's really important that you and I sit here and yes, we point out the systemic failure, and yes, we can point out the officers at the time that made those decisions. Under those circumstances, though, they are working within the system that was in operation at the time. Now, could they have made better decisions than that? Yes, they could have, and they can. We've spoken about that, and they can own that. However, what we are determining here is the system of operation that the state police were functioning under. We're not throwing all of the police force under the bus, and certainly you and I have a number of friends and colleagues who are officers at the moment, and they're performing that duty, and so much respect to them for what they do and have to go through every day.
I'm born blue. My father was a police officer for many years.
Absolutely, and that's not a point to lose sight of either. So when we talk about this, it's certainly not, as I say, throwing the entire police force and community under the bus. We have immense respect for the work they do. We are talking about decisions made under a system that didn't allow a better circumstance. So, I just want to make that really clear that it's not us throwing everyone under the bus here.
But that's not an excuse either, because
No.
at the end of the day, systems are only as good as the individuals that enact within them.
Yes.
Those officers that were involved in this did have the option of
Correct.
doing other things. As Mark John said, you had the power to arrest.
Yes.
That is your primary function. You did not pursue your primary function. You washed your car. Yes, I'm hung up on that. And we are here as a result.
Yeah. There is a piece on this. We've covered a lot of ground so far, Sean. I started at the very top of this episode making an analogy of having no mud, no lotus. In a moment, I really want to talk about those shining lights that I referred to earlier and how that lotus has really blossomed out of these horrible circumstances. I mentioned just before about shining lights coming out of this and a lotus blooming out of these horrific circumstances. To get there, I want to ask you a bridging sort of question. At this stage, we've gone through the process of the trial and everything, and we've had the coronial inquest, we've had those results or responses from that come out. At this stage, what's your relationship with Aman in particular?
We were very friendly at this point. We would speak on the phone whenever the circumstances arose, something to do with the case, something to do with the coronial inquest, something to do with the investigation, anything like that. Aman was telling me at the time that he was very interested in two things. He wanted to start up a foundation in honour of his mum.
Sure.
And he wanted to explore getting into political life because he thought that was the best way that he could make some positive change.
Okay. Not to sound, I guess, negative or anything of that nature, how often do you hear those sorts of statements from people in that emotive state once something has just sort of concluded in this trial process, etc.?
Yeah, it's fairly common. A lot of people come out of these traumatic situations looking for, and I mean this in the good way, a way to control their surroundings.
Of course.
A way to make sure someone else doesn't feel the same way.
Absolutely.
And that passion and fire and fury carries them a certain amount of the way. Not everybody does it. Very few people do. In the 20 years I've been doing this, I can probably count on the fingers of one hand how many have actually followed through with that. All of them have made a positive change in some way.
Sure.
But not in terms of that larger scale foundation or public organisation type of thing.
And I should say, that's absolutely, from my perspective, not a knock on anyone who says that and doesn't follow through, because
not at all.
There is a huge amount of grieving and navigation of all of this situation that's happened to yourself. You just need to find a way at times to survive through this. So, as I say, it's absolutely not for me a knock on that in any way, shape or form. I just know that most people, I'm going to make a difference. This is going to be the thing that spurs me to do that. I say that because these children, out of this horrific circumstance, absolutely did that.
That's exactly right. Look, Anita was younger, obviously, than all of her siblings, and she was very much, by her brother's own words, a source of endless positivity and optimism for her siblings. Atena, well, let's face it, she suffered as badly as her mother did, right up to the very end.
From an abusive situation,
That's
sure.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Portrait of quiet and refined strength. She has spoken publicly over the years about different things, but she's been more reserved about it. She's chosen her moments well, chosen her words incredibly well. The woman that I saw on the stand that day, giving that eloquent and heartbreaking account of the murder, has gone on to give eloquent and heartbreaking accounts for other people and at exactly the right times. She is what I'll call a targeted speaker. She knows what she's going to say, when she's going to say it, for the maximum positive effect.
Yeah, fabulous.
And then there's Arman, who is the public face of everything. I mean, his CV is incredible.
Yeah. It is. We'll get to that in a moment. I want to understand, as I said, you have seen him. And look, we're talking about a 4-year process at this stage from the moment the tragedy of these children losing their mother to 4 years on. We've now had the coronial inquest done and all of that. That's a 4-year span. You must have seen a lot of growth as a man in that sense from him.
The first time I met Arman, he was my mental picture, ramrod straight.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was a boy in a suit. And I don't mean that to disrespect him in any way, shape, or form, but he was a boy who had been placed in the situation of being the man of his family.
Yes.
Twice over. Once to help his mother, and now in his mother's absence.
Yeah.
Ramrod straight, tie uptight, you know, very upstanding young man speaking. I remember one of the first interviews we did after it was all finished. He took his tie off while we were speaking. And that was a transformative moment for me to see him just relax and go, okay, the formality is done. Now it's about what I can bring as me, as a human being.
Yeah, amazing. Look, let's talk about some of the wonderful stuff that has occurred from this. As we said, I keep going back to the concept of the lotus, and there's a distinct reason. Firstly, that analogy I used, no mud, no lotus, is one of my favorites because it just talks about how you can have something beautiful come out of something that often is troubling, harsh, whatever it might be. The lotus is also the symbol of the Zahra Foundation. The Zahra Foundation, of course, was created by all three of these children, Atena, Anita, and of course Arman, in their mother's honour. And it was created in the sense that what they wanted to do, they wanted to be able to assist women and children who are affected by domestic violence because they wanted to empower them from an economic or financial perspective. So often a lot of women and families are trapped in this cycle and this circumstance because they don't have the financial ability to remove themselves. It's very easy. A lot of people say, well, why don't you just leave? That's incredibly difficult at times. And there's often a financial, economic reason that traps them in this situation. So they have created the wonderful Zahra Foundation to do that. And I just want to, so go ahead.
And that fills a gap. That's one of the things Arman said to me when he said, look, hey, we're starting the foundation. Great. You know, it's always wonderful when you hear that it's actually gone all the way through. And he said, we are going to close that gap. There are a lot of great charities out there, a lot of great organizations that do so much work that helped us as well in so many ways. Here's a way that hasn't been helped. This is what we're going to do.
Yeah. I just want to give you some more details about the Zahra Foundation and what it is. So, look, they launched this on the 5th of September 2015. So, as you can tell, we are talking not too far down the track from these dates. I want to tell you where and how because this is, I think, truly amazing. And this is something that when you and I spoke about this, we both delighted with how amazing and wonderful is this moment.
Yeah.
So they decided to launch this, as I said, September 2015, at the Adelaide Convention Centre so that they could reclaim the space for Zahra and her family.
Talk about exercising your demons.
Absolutely. So they could take back that place, that space, that moment for their mother and everything that stood. And I want to say there was over 400 guests there. And I want, and not just anyone, there were some really prominent Australians and people of merit. However, I want to say again, there was even more people there at the launch of this than there actually was at the initial event. And I just think how amazing and wonderful and what a great thought process to reclaim that in this manner. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the extra work they do. As their website's now stating, and I'll say it again, zahrafoundation.org.au. I said it at the start and I'll say it later again. They have created small grants. Over almost $40,000 have been granted out to 134 families to help them in these circumstances. 221 women have accessed specialist financial counselling. They've created over 72 individual programs, and there's a pathway to empowerment enrolments of 215. This is the work that this organisation is doing. It is based purely on the thought process of these three children who have come out of this and have shown what you talked about before, that strength and that solidarity to make a difference in the memory of their mother, who, as everyone has said, was a wonderful, gracious human being.
Recognising what would have helped them in the moment and making sure that help is there for the next family that finds themselves in that same moment.
Yeah. The last thing I want to talk a little bit about this is I keep mentioning the Lotus, and the reason, as I said, it was such a wonderful time for me to be able to use a statement that's really important to me and to this organisation, because the Zahra Foundation logo actually features a lotus flower. Across many cultures, it's a symbolic image of purity and beauty. They've also gone one step further, and they've made this a purple lotus, which was symbolic of women's suffrage. And they've chosen that because it represents Zahra's strength through this, her beauty and her presence through this moment as well. So please, check out the zahrafoundation.org.au. I keep saying that. It is one of the most wonderful things that the three children together have done. The other shining light I want to talk about, and you mentioned before, and I said, the CV of Aman himself. Let me just run down what this gentleman has gone on to achieve in spite of the example set by his father. Aman is a White Ribbon Ambassador. He's a Medal of Order of Australia recipient, and that's recognising Australian citizens for their achievement or meritorious service. He actually represented Australia in Taekwondo. In 2015, he received the Alan Sloan Young Citizen of the Year. 2016, he was the Young Australian of the Year for South Australia. 2017, the City of Charles Sturt Young Citizen. He went on to become a council member at his local government. He now sits, Sean, where?
On the Adelaide City Council, here in the CBD.
Absolutely. And you said to me, you've got a funny feeling one day we'll be seeing him quite prominent.
Look, I think that this is a young man who will actually use any political clout he has for the right reasons.
Sure.
And I think that the sky's the limit for someone with his drive and his determination, and most importantly, his empathy. You said a minute ago, he's achieved all this in spite of his father's example.
Yeah.
That's only half the story. He's achieved all of this because of his mother's example.
Correct.
Remember, Zahra was his father figure as well as his mother figure. She was his entire parentage. And I think everything he does is a tribute to her. Her life, her choices, her options were all taken away.
Agreed.
He's making sure that he's giving options and choices not only to himself, to his beautiful little family that he started, but to everybody else out there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I said before, our beliefs, are created by the experiences that we're exposed to. Some of us become those, some of us become what we do in spite of those, and he has certainly done the best of that. Now, in saying that, we have sort of start to finish covered the murder of Zahra Abrahimzadeh in some most tragic, horrible circumstances, the most overarching one being that of domestic violence. With that stated, on our next episode, we're going to take a bit of a different look at this. We're going to have a look at maybe the other side of this horrible circumstance that sadly so many people find themselves in. We're going to open up the idea of what is domestic violence versus self-defense. And we're going to try to understand the how, the why, and the what of when these ideas clash in certain circumstances. It's grey, it's murky, it's not necessarily nice territory.
And this is an issue that's been very important to me throughout my entire career, because what do you do when your life is threatened? You react. You react to survive. But what happens when the law decides that what you've done to survive is unlawful? Is there justice in that, or is there no justice? We've seen what happened to Zahra because she had nowhere else to turn, and when she did leave, the system didn't protect her. What happens to those women that feel they have no other choice but to strike back?
It's going to be very interesting. It's going to do what this episode in this series has done, I'm sure. It's going to touch on some very sensitive stuff and possibly triggering, as we've mentioned a number of times. If that has been the case for you, please, Domestic Violence Crisis Service on 1300 782 200, Domestic Violence Gateway Service on 1800 800 098, National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service on 1800 RESPECT. Of course, the Zahra Foundation at zahrafoundation.org.au. I keep banging on about it, the DV Safe Phone at dvsafephone.org as well. And a massive thank you to everyone who has listened to our broadcast here on 5AA, or you've tuned in and called us on iTunes and Spotify for the podcast version. Please go there, rate, review, subscribe. You can get a hold of us, as always, at Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. Of course, you can follow Sean and his work with the Advertiser and the True Crime of Adelaide at Sean Fuster on Facebook and Twitter. It continues, Sean, next week. It's going to be an interesting ride as we start to look at what else does this horrible situation of domestic violence actually cover.
Absolutely.
Until we get there, as always, we want to remind you to enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you all on the next episode of Just Lawful.